So you're browsing Amazon and you run across something like this, a 12-inch subwoofer for only 35 bucks. That's really cheap. Can you go wrong with something that cheap? Not only are we gonna find out, we're gonna kick it up to the next level and we're gonna compare 4 12-inch subwoofers that you can find for under $35. Let's crack these open and see what they're all about. The first subwoofer is the GRS from Parts Express. I've used this subwoofer in the past, and I'll give you a link to the build down in the video description. It is, well, nothing special. It's got a polycone or rubber surround, a 2-inch 4-ohm voice coil, and it's rated for 120 watts RMS. It does have a pole vent on the back of the magnet, but no other venting. The packaging is minimalist. It's just a cardboard box with no packing material to protect the sub during shipping. It weighs in at about 6 pounds and 5 ounces. Up next is the SSL SS12 high power subwoofer. SSL stands for Soundstorm Labs. If you're not familiar with the brand, it's owned by somebody that you are familiar with, Boss International Group. That's right, Boss, the king of made-up power ratings. This flimsy little subwoofer weighs in at an underwhelming 4 pounds and 15 ounces. The Boss, the SSL, looks a lot like the GRS from the back. This is also a single 4-ohm voice coil with a max power of 800 watts with no RMS power listed. It was under 35 bucks when I ordered it. You'll need to hit the link below to see the most current up-to-date pricing. This is a Belva 12-inch subwoofer. Belva and MVX are Sonic Electronics house brands. And you can buy this sub for about $35 at the link in the video description. A few things about this sub: it has pole vents and vents on the basket, but it also has this nice thick rubber gasket. Plus it is the heaviest sub of the group. This 600 watt max power weighs in at 8 pounds and 2 ounces. Next up is this Hifonics subwoofer that I picked up on Amazon, rated for 800 watts max power. It is the only dual voice coil subwoofer of the group, and it weighs in at just over 6 pounds. It also has this hideous plastic shroud covering up the magnet. I'm not a fan of these, it's just there for looks. It doesn't do anything. And after unboxing these subwoofers, I think that somebody's lying to me. The SSL and the GRS look to be almost identical other than the cone, and the SSL weighs quite a bit less, which means that it has a smaller magnet and therefore should handle less power. The Belva and the Hifonics look to be the better of the 4, the Belva being a whole lot beefier and the Hifonics having the dual voice coil. That's really handy. It means you can wire a pair of these down to 1 ohm and then hook it up to something like, say, the Legis Audio amplifier and get some really cheap bass. In fact, that's kind of the main reason why you might be interested in a $35 subwoofer. Throw this in a cheap box and power them with a cheap amp, grab a decent 8-gauge wire kit, and you can have bass in your ride for under $200. What do you say we take a few measurements? Here I'm using a UMIC 1 in a laptop running Room Equalization Wizard. A few caveats before we wire these things up. For some reason, this laptop doesn't play well with my mic and Room EQ Wizard. I don't know why, but I can't seem to get the levels to calibrate properly on this laptop. Works fine on my desktop. I'm currently saving up for a new laptop so I can set up these kind of tests out in the garage. And I couldn't afford things like laptops without the support of my patrons over on Patreon. So thanks to all of my supporters. And I want to give a shout out to Bo, David T, Bam Bam, Dylan, Fargo, JD America, and Baba. Now the second caveat, these results are what we call relative results, not absolute results. What that means is that I don't have an anechoic chamber, so these measurements are very specific for the room and the enclosure that I'm testing them in. That allows me to compare these 4 subwoofers to each other, but you can't take the data and compare them to some other subwoofer. Let's start with the SSL. We see a big peak just above 70 Hertz and virtually no low-end extension. The lack of low-end extension is partially due to the enclosure. I opted to put this in a very cheap prefab box. All right, now let's drop in the GRS. Yep. I poked a hole in the surround. Believe it or not, that's the first time I've ever done that. Well, we've already got it in the box. We might as well measure it anyway and see how it does. And it's almost identical to the SSL, but the SSL appears to be just a tad bit more sensitive. Now out with the GRS and in with the Hifonics. The Hifonics is just a tad less sensitive and seems to be a little bit less peaky. I'm going to clean up the graph a little bit by getting rid of the SSL and GRS lines before we test the Belva. And the Belva seems to be a little bit less sensitive, and it peaks at about 10 Hertz less than the Hifonics. Well, what does that tell us? That mostly tells us that we have a box that's not tuned very low, and it tells us that we're probably going to struggle with low-end extension. But these subwoofers should be able to get pretty loud in that kind of 50 to 80 Hertz range. So if you listen to a lot of rock and roll or country music, these might do the trick. But if you're into the really low stuff, rebased music, that kind of thing, this setup is probably not going to work for you. How about some in-car testing? Let's start with the GRS. As far as sound quality goes, it gets the job done, but it does sound a little bit boomy, which is really what you would expect for a woofer like this in this particular enclosure. Next, what I want to do is turn the bass knob up until I get close to the rated RMS value and see what kind of SPL we get. I'm using a 60 Hertz tone for all these tests. And we get a perfectly respectable 126 dB. But it does seem odd to me that the GRS and the SSL look so similar and have such huge differences in their power ratings. So I'm gonna go ahead and crank it up to 300, 400 watts and see what happens with more power. And we get a 130.5 at 370 watts before the AUM1 slides out of view because of all the vibration. I'm trying to run my main camera plus 2 GoPros while I do all these tests, and it's kind of tricky to keep all these cameras going at the same time. And hey, that's pretty good for a subwoofer with a hole in the surround. Since it's already damaged, why don't we just go ahead and see how much power it can take before we smoke it. So I forgot to turn the camera on. I did smoke the GRS. I haven't reviewed the footage yet, so we'll put up on screen how much power it took to smoke it. That scraping sound means the voice coil is shot. When I get a chance, I'll take this apart and see how bad the damage is. Now we're going to drop in the SSL and do the exact same things. Sound quality wise, it's less boomy than the GRS, and the distortion you're hearing is from the microphone clipping. It sounded perfectly clean to me. For the SPL run, one of the GoPros powered off, so I can't show you the power numbers, but we do have the SPL numbers. And we get really similar results to the GRS. I got 129.6 dB, and that was around 300 watts on the AMM1. So there you go, those two subs seem to be a lot alike. But we've already smoked one subwoofer. Why don't we see how much power this can take before we let the magic smoke out of the SSL. Whoa! We got quite the light show. Sparks started flying at 990 watts, which is really close to the GRS. And you'll notice that right at the end, the AMM1 shot up to just about 1400 watts. Next up is the Hifonics. Sound quality wise, it seemed to be a little bit better. I think it was louder, probably because it was wired down to 2 ohms and it therefore was drawing a bit more power. Now on the 60 Hertz test tone, we're going to run the power up to just a bit more than half of its peak power rating and see what we get. 129.5 dB. So really not any louder than the SSL. Let's take a look at how much power it can handle before it goes up in smoke. And what I want you to do is rewind this and look at the numbers real close. We saw over 2,000 watts at one point. Then as the voice coil started to heat up, the impedance started to rise, and we're down to about 1,100 watts when it started to smoke. Okay, I'm expecting big things out of the Belva since it's quite a bit beefier than the others. Just like all the others, we're gonna start off by listening to some music, and I'll give you my subjective assessment on the sound quality. All right, here's what I think. I think it sounds just like the others. And all of these sound just fine for subwoofers in this price range. Now for all these SPL tests, my goal was to run the amp right at the rated power or half of the max power if no RMS rating was provided. So the Belva has 600 watts of max power. Running it at about 300 watts gives me 130.5. And what we see is that if you run these things at about 300 to 400 watts, they're all gonna give you about the same amount of SPL. Well, we went ahead and smoked the other ones. Let's see how much power this one can take before it goes up in smoke. Before I pick a winner, I want to take them apart. I took a crowbar and bashed off some of the plastic on that Hifonics sub, and underneath that tacky plastic cover, it looks just like the others. And hey, this is actually kind of important. Check out these voice coils. The SSL has a tiny voice coil. The coils for the rest all appear to be about 2-inch coils. If you look at the voice coil formers, the Belva appears to be a Captain voice coil former, and the rest use aluminum. The Captain melted when things got a little hot. So who's the winner? Well, that's not the right question. The real question is, should you even bother with subwoofers in this price range? That's really going to depend on your budget. My recommendation is not to buy one, buy two instead. That will let you run more power, plus you'll get some extra output from having the second cone. They all really perform about the same, and they all perform just fine for a subwoofer in this price range. But if I were forced to choose, I'd go with the Hifonics. It's got better power handling, plus if you get two of them, you can wire everything down to 1 ohm. And there are a ton of great budget amplifiers that you can pair with a pair of these subs. Check out this playlist right here for some examples. I'm Justin, this is the DIY Audio Guy YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.